Welcome to Reimagining Liberty, a show about the emancipatory and cosmopolitan case for radical social, political, and economic freedom. I'm Aaron Ross Powell. One of my goals for this show is to explore the complexities of issues people have strong opinions about and assume are straightforward. And it's difficult to think of one that fits that bill better than guns. Today, I'm joined by my longtime friend and Free Thoughts podcast co-host, constitutional lawyer Trevor Burrus. We talk about the causes of and misconceptions around gun violence, and how a free society should approach both the role of guns and the challenges of limiting the harm they do. If you enjoy Reimagining Liberty, I encourage you to subscribe to my free newsletter, where I write frequently about the kinds of issues we discuss on the show. And if you want to support my work, you can become a member and get early access to all new episodes. Learn more by heading to reimaginingliberty.com. With that, let's turn to my conversation with Trevor. Basically, every day there's a story in the news about gun violence, whether that is a murder or a mass shooting somewhere, something that is horrific and feels like it ought to be preventable. So why does this happen and what can we do about
it? You start off with the big questions. Why does it happen? Well, let's go back to, say, 1965, before the Gun Control Act of 68. And the AR-15 existed. It was invented in the late 50s. But mass shootings were kind of unknown. There were mass killings of different types in this country for its whole history, unfortunately. But the mass shootings were not, directly related to access to guns. You have the University of Texas mass shooting in the 60s, where the guy went onto the clock tower and was shooting people from the clock tower. And then, of course, you have Columbine, which, being from Colorado and from that area, was very important and salient to me. I knew people who were there. And then you have kind of this crime script that happens for that. Now, the important question we have to ask, when I say crime script, by the way, I mean, I think that there are different times where serial killers of the 1970s, where you have, they write letters to the newspaper and they, do all this kind of crazy stuff. And we don't really hear about those anymore. And there could be a variety of reasons for that, including, better policing. But so we have a crime script now of mass shootings in public places. The best question to ask, though, is what you asked, and you just led with the, how do we stop it? What do we do about it? And I'm like, well, it's a really, really difficult problem. I don't think the first question we should ask is gun control. And I think we need to properly, appreciate the benefits of having guns in private hands, which is actually kind of the whole debate in a weird way. There's a lot of people, where I live, here in Northern Virginia. It's a very, very blue place. I think many of the people here, although there are a lot of military people, so take those people out, but many of the people here do not think that owning a gun is almost like a moral act by itself. No matter what you do with it, owning a gun is somehow, you have these stories about people saying, I need to, before I send my kids over to play at your house, I need to know if there are guns there. And I'm not criticizing parenting on that. Kids do crazy things with guns sometimes. But it's more about just making, they really think that guns are a pollutant. So whether it's moral to even own a gun is kind of the first question, I think, now in gun policy.
That's an interesting point, because it feels like there's two narratives about the possession of guns in this country. And like so much else, they're culture war aligned. And so on the one hand, you have the guns are useful for self-defense, they're good for hunting. Um, and on the other hand, you have the basically America is a gun nut culture, that this isn't really about self-defense. It's maybe hunting, but most people who have a gun are probably not out there hunting with it. And besides, you don't need to hunt with an AR-15 or a handgun. And that this is really just kind of some pathology of violence for which the gun is the totem. And it seems like you can make an argument that there's truth to both sides of that, right? Like there are genuinely people who own guns for defense, but there are, there's every now and then at Christmas, there's those Christmas cards will go around from various right-wing lawmakers where it's like their whole family, including their pets, posing with handguns as in this kind of like intentionally aggressive, in your face way that it's like, hey, libs, you hate this, come and take my guns kind of thing. And it does seem to be a little unseemly. And so how much of it is, how much of gun ownership is what we would call, I don't want to say legitimate, but like self-defense, non-cultural, and how much of widespread gun ownership is that there is something to American culture about the symbolic importance, at the very least, of possessing the capability to do violence in this kind of abrupt and powerful way.
Well, the first thing I would say is that there's what I call extremification, which is my term for when both sides make each other more extreme based on the positions that they're taking. So back, say in the 60s again, you had shooting clubs in high schools in New York, which is, beyond the pale to even imagine today. I mean, I don't think I'm not even sure there's shooting clubs in Oklahoma, but like you have shooting clubs and you have a broader consensus about the idea that a gun is just a tool you have in your house. And it serves multiple purposes, but most of the time it's doing nothing. Maybe you hunt with it, and most people, even kind of anti-gun people, concede the hunting thing, it's interesting because I don't like hunting at all. I don't like killing things, but they concede the hunting thing. And then you have an idea of sort of like inherent self-defense, which is sort of accepted broadly, and just this idea that you have a gun, like, because one day the things may come down and you might need it. And I think there was a broader consensus that there was, especially among African Americans, the idea that having a gun, your grandfather's gun that he might have used to defend against lynch mobs, it's still in your house. It still works. It just sort of sits there. This famous quote by Ida B. Wells about, a gun like is defending a freedom. But that's a black swan event. It's a long tail event. Like most of the time, that's not going to happen. That something's so. There's three reasons of having a gun that have nothing to do with what you said, Aaron, about like you have it because you intend to commit violence against other people, sort of indiscriminately. Like you have it for hunting, you have it as for fun, and let's not forget about that part. Shooting is fun, and it almost never hurts anyone just going to the gun range. And you have it for possibly the time when things might get bad. And I think that I don't like to bring that up as my first point when I do gun debates, but the pandemic was an interesting time where this came up to people suddenly. I had at least 5 friends who I would describe as left message me during the early days of the pandemic and ask me what sort of gun should they buy. This is where you're like this when suddenly it seems like, and if you remember, I feel like the pandemic is like it's almost like been memory hold in a weird way. But at those first weeks when you were like, oh my God, they stopped the like NBA season. They're like shut down the NHL. We have no idea what's happening. We're trying to get toilet paper and food and all this stuff in those first weeks. It was you being afraid of your neighbors more than like the government. And that's why my friends who are on the left said, what kind of gun should I buy? And gun ownership went up a lot during the pandemic. So I think you're mischaracterizing the way people own guns. Like it is an object to commit violence. Like one of the things it does is commit violence. When I go to the shooting range, of course, it's not doing that at all. Like, and I brought people to the shooting range who were pretty anti-gun, and then were a little bit disturbed by how much they liked it. They just liked shooting a gun. Like they thought it was like a bad thing to like. So I don't think your characterization of what guns are is accurate. There are many things to many people.
The closing of the NHL probably reduced overall violence during the pandemic. But to the point that guns are fun, I can imagine a lot of people hearing that and saying that's not a terribly persuasive argument, because there are lots of things that might be fun that nonetheless are dangerous. And we say, so drag racing is fun for the people who are drag racing, but it's probably like good that we have laws against drag racing out on the roads. And guns, we could say like, yeah, sure, you might have fun. And there might be people out there who don't think they'd have fun, but actually like would if they go and try it. But the negative externalities of a culture that has a lot of guns in it are huge. Namely, people getting killed or maimed by guns. And so getting rid of them, not having those, might mean that you get to, you have to go to a bow and arrow range instead, or something else that like you have to trade off to something that you might not enjoy as much, but that's a worthwhile trade-off to end the cost that a culture with hundreds of millions of guns in it puts on the rest of us.
So you're bringing up, I think, the best argument against guns, which is that they commit more serious violence in an easier way than, say, a bow and arrow. But points I want to make what you said. So one, it does matter that people enjoy shooting, working on, collecting guns. That is a relevant point. The data is, there's a lot of people who like to bring up that there's a lot of people who own, like there's some people who own a lot of guns, like a lot of guns, and they're like, wow, you own like 300 guns, like how could that? You must be a psychopath. Those people are hobbyists. It's their hobby. Like me and guitars, and Aaron, like me and synthesizers. Like the room I'm sitting in right now is full of guitars and synthesizers. The 80-20 rule applies, whereas I own something like 13 guitars, and there's like 20% of the people who own like 80% of the guitars, and what they really like to do is work on them, play them, enjoy them. Now, of course, this is a bad analogy because guitars don't hurt anyone unless you bash someone over the head with one. But people, as I said, guns have other uses to them that are important. And like the most important thing about a good gun, and like I said, people who work on them, they collect them, they like them as historical artifacts and stuff. But the most important thing about a good gun in terms of interpersonal violence, and I'm going to make that very clear, like it is a tool partially for interpersonal violence. is that it effectively projects force over a distance, meaning like it accurately projects force over a distance. It does not jam. It does not, it works correctly in projecting force over a distance. And that makes the gun really useful for both violence and self-defense, like at the same time. It's the exact same characteristic that makes it useful for both things. So again, I think that we have to step back and think of, we can talk about gun culture, and we could talk about, we should talk about where some of that comes from, like why people are victimizing other people with guns, and whether or not that correlates with gun ownership. But we also need to respect the fact, even if we disagree with it, even if we like I don't like NASCAR, right? Like, I mean, there's many things I don't like, and I don't understand why people like them. But you have to respect that people like them if they're not doing anything violent to anyone else when they like those things. That seems like a basic philosophical principle to me. And again, 99% of the guns in America are doing nothing. They're like sitting in a case in a house, like doing nothing. But going back to the pandemic example, they make some people, some people use them for entertainment, and some people feel good if they have one in their house and they feel more secure. And like that's the other part of this where you brought up that like we don't know the answer to the question, statistically speaking, of do people own more guns and that creates more violence, or do people buy guns because they live in a violent situation? It's hard to figure out where that causal arrow runs. A huge amount of violence, I can break it down, distinctly. Like you do not need a gun to rob a 5 foot, 100 pound woman. Like a man does not need a gun to do that at all, or a knife. Like much of the violence that occurs, like still would occur without guns. The big question, though, that we have to seriously consider is how much of the violence is actually being quote unquote created by guns, in the sense that someone was not going to commit a crime and then they did commit a crime. And then the other question we have to ask is how many people can defend themselves if they have a gun that couldn't defend themselves before. Like that's the mature way of having this discussion. And then of course we have to talk about suicides.
Let's do that then. Let's talk about the effects of gun ownership on violence and on deaths. Because it doesn't, if I just tell you, like, how many guns are there in this country?
We think about 400 million, but we're not exactly sure.
So there is more than one gun in the United States for every man, woman, and child in the country. There's more than the total population.
Yes, definitely. But again, as I said, it's not evenly distributed, because there's some people who own like 200.
But
yes.
The upshot is
guitar ownership is also not evenly distributed.
There's an extraordinary number of guns in the country, and guns are very powerful tools for inflicting harm. And so it seems not unreasonable to think there's probably a lot more harm being inflicted in this country because we have so many of these things and they're so readily available than there would be otherwise. What's wrong with that claim?
So it might be true. If I could like snap my fingers and like Thanos away like the guns in America, it might be true. It would require a discussion of how crime is committed and why crime is committed. So a lot of people listening to this might not believe this, and I didn't believe it when I first started studying this. But the number of times, like the way that guns help self-defense. So you talked about the negative externalities. Like the positive externalities are sort of misunderstood. One is that people use guns to defend themselves. I would say, being very conservative, the estimate would be somewhere between 1 million and 1.5 million times a year. Now, people say, oh, like, does that mean that we just have people shooting each other or like in response to like threats all the time? No, because a gun is such a powerful tool that you can just show it like in most of these situations. Like, so someone comes up to your house and they want to break in and you walk out and you show them you have a gun and they walk away, like, and that's how that situation resolved. It's never, reported as a crime, possibly never reported as a crime. Actually, quite often people who are often in those high crime places don't trust the police. So we have to talk about there's an relationship between policing and gun ownership. We have to remember that, like, how safe you feel is very much related to this idea that the government has taken over your self defense and done it effectively, right? That, like, and we have, so there, that you have to talk about police policy too, so we can put that on the platter for later. But like, so that's one way that people use guns for self defense. Another way is actually just a positive externality, where you have a city. My analogy is always like, let's imagine you take a 10,000 person city and you distribute guns to half the people in the city, but you don't tell anyone where the guns are. Does crime go up or down in that city? And that's a really, really fascinating question. Of course, we have not run that randomized controlled trial, but so there'll be some people who, because they got like a free gun, will be like, "Oh, I'm going to rob a 7-Eleven now." There will be. I mean, like, this is one of the bad arguments that gun rights people make, is that guns don't cause crime. Guns can absolutely cause crime, but we're talking about the margins here. So there's how much there's a person who decides to commit a crime who would not have been committing any other crimes because they have a gun, versus the person on the other side of the margin who now has the ability to defend themselves, who didn't have the ability to effectively defend themselves before. And so that again, that's where the question has to happen. Uh, if you made them all disappear, going back to your original question, what you would have, in my opinion, I mean, again, it's not possible. So, like, we have to first start with the possibility of it. You cannot make all the guns in America disappear, but if you made them all disappear, some crime would go down and some crime would go up in different ways. Some of that crime, like the lethality rate of gun crime, is higher than, like, not, well, there's actually some interesting data on this, but like, it's often higher. So you would still have women being robbed on the street by large men who just have to use their fists or a knife, and you would still have people robbing stores in the same way, assuming all these people are disarmed. But you would have probably fewer deaths from, like mass deaths, of course. But you could still kill a lot of people in creative ways. I'm putting that in scare quotes, but like using a truck, for example, like happened in France. And the thing that would go down is the suicide rate, I think. And that's 2/3 of gun deaths in America, and the thing that is not discussed in terms of like how we should be addressing this problem.
What about the worry about impulsiveness? So, yes, it might be that there are some people who might commit a crime because they have a gun and wouldn't have before. But it seems like there's going to be a lot of people who might have committed a crime, but now the crime lethality goes up. And the one issue with guns is their suddenness. So your hypothetical town, the 7-Eleven might not get robbed as often because people know, or there might be fewer property crimes, at least property crime, like breaking and entering at a house, because they might worry about a gun being inside of it. But the abusive husband in there might be more likely to kill his spouse if he's drunk and angry and has a handgun than if he's drunk and angry and has his fists. And that seems like potentially a bigger deal than the amount of, like we know that the overwhelming majority, like murders are typically committed by someone that knows the victim. Their domestic violence is very, very common. Um, it seems like putting guns in the hands of those people is maybe a bigger deal than preventing break-ins.
Yeah, yeah. I just think as a policy matter, I mean, also as a philosophical matter, because I do believe in the individual right to own a gun. But like, if I was just doing a policy question, we should have an appreciation of the impulsiveness that you discussed in those situations, and we've addressed that in law. And the other one again that we'll talk about, because I think that gun suicide is often quite impulsive, and so we had to talk about how we diminish gun deaths uh, through different policies, but it would not just be gun policies. You did when we were in law school together. You were a juror on a murder trial that came out of a party where it seemed like, the way you told it to me, like almost everyone was packing.
That was the impression that I got. And yes, just for listeners, it was a Halloween party in kind of a tough area of Denver. Some guys who I don't think were invited, party crashers, showed up. They had guns. A fight broke out. Shooting started, and some people got killed and others injured. And it seems like that's a situation where it's very likely that a fight would have broken out at that party, but it's also likely that had they not had guns, you probably would not have had a couple of people dead.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. But the question is why were they packing? Why were they carrying guns? Why do we put people? Why are people put in these situations? It's the same question as suicide. Suicide is not. I mean, there's a gun part of it, but there's of course a mental health part of it. Why aren't people? Can we get people to seek mental health treatment when they're feeling suicidal? One of the vectors we could use is to say, well, we should take their guns away. We could talk about that. But same thing of in like this party situation is like what creates the kind of situation where people feel like they need to bring a gun to a party. Because again, you could have done that easier, technically speaking, in 1960 in terms of acquiring a gun and bringing a gun to a party than you could now. And we can talk about the kind of how does the trend line of crime and guns correlate? It doesn't correlate at all internationally or by state or by time. We have more guns now and we have lower crime. So we have if we don't dispute that data, and I think the data is quite clear, where the correlation between guns and interpersonal gun violence, I'm setting aside suicides, is non-existent, then our first thing should not be guns. Like in terms of a policy proposal, like just in terms of all these other important things, which I do think guns are important for, like defending against, a government that might possibly be part of the lynch mob against you, that kind of long tail event. But like, if that data is true, then the question should be about something other than guns. Like, that just seems like an obvious point to me. Like, it's like, if guns and interpersonal gun violence do not correlate, like gun ownership and interpersonal gun violence do not correlate, then why does violence go up and down? Like,
so is the argument then that America, for probably a lot of reasons, is a particularly violent place and culture?
Absolutely.
And that focusing all of our attention and that reacting negatively against that culture of violence, which I mean, it would be better if we were a less violent people than we are. Um, that if that reacting against that by saying guns are the problem, let's get rid of guns, goes wrong in two ways, if I'm understanding what you're saying correctly. The first is that it misdiagnoses the causes of the problem in a way that would tell us that, in fact, if we could get rid of guns, it wouldn't have quite the effect on violence that gun control proponents argue for. And it also goes wrong in the sense that it underestimates what would be involved in getting rid of guns, like what it would look like to say round up all 400 million guns in this country.
Yeah, so to the first point, yes, I'm not saying that violence wouldn't go down. Definitely was saying that suicide would go down. If you, again, like made the guns disappear. But again, you have to imagine the situation where you have the guns disappear, and so you have a 5 foot, 100-pound woman and a 6 foot man, and you take guns from both of them. And so the 6 foot man wants to rob the 5 foot woman. It doesn't really change anything. So yes, that is part of the question. I'm not sure total violence would go down. Second, to your point, is the logistics. And this is like a point that I've made a bunch where I compare gun control to immigration control. And it's a very similar, I've written an article years ago for Cato about this, where that the way that people argue against immigration is that they cite individual immigrant crimes, and they talk about immigrants who committed crimes, and then use that as a reason to want to round up all the immigrants. I mean, there's other analogies too we can talk about, but and people who are for gun control do the same thing. They cite individual crimes, and then they use that as a reason to want to round up all the guns. And the weird thing is like, the right wing now tends to believe that there's like no immigration laws, that we have like quote unquote open borders. And the left wing tends to believe, the gun control wing tends to believe that we have like no gun laws, that we have like, you can just walk into a Walmart and buy any gun you want. Both of those are wrong. But their ideal situation, so the anti-immigrant ideal situation is like completely controlled immigration is the way I would describe it. Like, the border is locked down. No one gets in that we don't want to get in. And you're not allowed to employ an immigrant or do anything unless it's like approved. And that is also what the gun control crowd believes about guns. It's like basically completely controlled guns, where maybe they're okay with people having guns for hunting and like, if they want to go shooting at the gun range, but they want it to be completely controlled. Both of those things are so quixotic and just fantasy that it needs to be part of the philosophical point. I mean, I'm wildly pro-immigration and pro-gun, but it needs to be part of the philosophical argument. The feasibility of a thing needs to be part of the philosophical argument about whether, and what I mean by this is that, in particular, is that if you wanted to enact the immigration control that the right, like those people on the right that I'm talking about, want, it would require civil liberties and law enforcement violations on a level that we have never seen. We've tried at different times, like we tried with the Alien and Espionage Act in World War One. And if you wanted to enact gun control on this level, it would require an exactly similar amount of civil liberties violations that we have never seen. And most of those will be done against minorities and people of color for a variety of reasons. So and people of lower means, especially. So that has to be a consideration. we have two conversations that we could have. One is if we move a thousand people, whatever, 100 people to Mars, what should gun control policy? Right. That's like one conversation. Like, should guns be locked up in some sort of locker and like only accessible by the space police kind of situation? Um, it's an interesting question. I'd have to talk about what the political situation of that place was and everything. But the second one is what should it be here? Like in this country or in any country that has like guns existing in the populace, and also where, and this is an important thing, where government is dangerous, it can be dangerous. And I know people are probably like might be rolling their eyes right now and saying like, oh, like, are you going to fight the U.S. government, the U.S. Army? F-16s and tanks. I'm like, no, that's not the point of this. Actually, it's that one, and we've had again, I said this is very related to policing. There's a lot of places in this country where the police do not do a good job or do a really bad job in the terms of like committing violence against the citizens. And so if the Lockean theory is that we are supposed to have like given up our right to self-protection, like, we take away all the guns and we say, okay, the government is now taking over your self-protection and they will always do it well. If that's the theory, then I would challenge you with history. I would challenge you, with the history of, Black Americans during Reconstruction who were defending themselves against the sheriff who was like leading the lynch mob. And you're like, oh, that's never going to happen. I think it's a big part of the gun control debate. Actually, is like this idea that we've civilized enough to the point that we like never ever need guns again. Like if you do believe that guns should be taken entirely out of people's hands, like there is this also idea like that we've civilized enough that this will never be a problem again, and that the police are really good at their jobs. And we won't have another pandemic where things might, go south, and that we've solved these basic problems of human existence. And I would challenge that thesis. And the way I would challenge it is just to say, so yeah, these are long tail events, and there's an inert piece of steel in my closet sitting there, that I occasionally use to go shooting at the range with for fun. But if that long tail event comes up, I don't want to not have that inert piece of steel that suddenly can help me out in protecting myself and my family.
What's the upper limit on that then? Like, should we, if all of that is true and gun ownership doesn't increase crime in the way that you've described it,
I'm not sure. I said that's the right question to ask. I'm not sure,
or at least doesn't appear to have clear
yeah
lines of effect there. Should we expand? Does that mean we should expand gun ownership, including both the quantity of people who have them, I don't know what the right term would be, but sophistication and power of the guns that are accessible to people? So things that shoot faster or shoot higher caliber, or, kill easier and faster. And should we expand guns into places where they're not currently allowed? Like, should everybody be able to carry a gun everywhere they want to? And should we encourage everybody to keep one on themselves at all times?
Obviously, if you're uncomfortable with guns, like you shouldn't own one. If you're uncomfortable with shooting, you shouldn't own one. That's fine. Like I said, it's the flip side of respecting the people who like to do that is respecting the people who don't like to do that. And like I don't generally have a problem with like people ask, like the example I brought up before, people asking if parents want to know if a house has guns. Like that's their prerogative. Like that's fine. When we talk about the characteristics of guns, and like, well, okay, I want to say one more thing about the first point, which is that the level of, if you allow gun ownership in a society, the level of gun ownership will change based on how unsafe people feel in that society. So this is not about like, everyone should carry, everyone should have a gun. I'm definitely not saying that. I'm just saying that the level, if a society becomes very unsafe, think about Ukraine right now, um, and the individual people there who are now, Ukraine had better gun ownership laws than most of Europe, like who are now glad that they have the right to have a gun in their house. Um, the pandemic is another example, as I mentioned, where the feeling of unsafety correlates with how much people want to have guns. That's also true with the feeling of unsafety in like the inner city, where the cops are not really a solution and often the problem. So then we have to think about your question of what is the characteristics of guns. It doesn't really matter um, in terms of the data, like what if the gun works. So again, remember what I've said, that the 2/3 of these gun deaths are suicides. So, but of middle-aged men between 25 and 64. So one of these things is to say it like magazine restrictions on, characteristics like physical characteristics of guns, like whether or not it has an extendable stock or has a pistol grip, which is some of the definitions of a quote unquote assault weapon, would have no effect on the suicide rate. The other one is the murder rate connected with the drug war of young black men. And so again, we like to talk about like assault weapons and like whether or not we should ban them, but we are, and then people will cite the total amount of gun deaths, and when they do that, they cite the suicides too. And I've had people disagree with on this, but all I want to say is that the policy response to suicide and interpersonal gun violence would be very different. Like, I mean, that just seems like an obvious point. The suicide thing is, should we address it with guns? Should we address it with mental health? The interpersonal gun violence thing, should we do something like end the drug war? Like, which is one of the things that is putting people into situations where they start shooting each other. And this is how we have a mature conversation about gun violence committed with guns, that does not just focus on the presence of guns, because that's become a culture war thing. And so we can't really have this mature discussion anymore. Uh, in terms of your specific questions, I mean, think about it logistically. I've done this too much, and it gets disturbing. It makes my brain have to think about, violence in weird ways. But like, how much difference does it actually make in terms of deaths to limit handguns from like 18 to 10 rounds, for example? Well, it's an empirical question. It's hard to test, but it's an empirical question. Most of those shootings do not discharge more than 10 rounds. We can, so like we have to start asking these like uncomfortable questions. But like the uncomfortable questions I think we should be asking are not about like, should we like, so the amount of magazines out there that are above 18 rounds, and like what it would mean to make everyone a felon who owns one. They owned a legal thing and suddenly they're like, they own an illegal thing. Is that an effective way of looking at this problem, or are there other things that we should be looking at to try and like work on this problem? Like, obviously, magazine restrictions and almost any restriction that is discussed popularly would not affect the suicide rate at all. Like, and as I've told you many times, one of my just biggest pet peeves. Well, it's not. I mean, it's not a pet peeve. It's a righteous indignation, is people citing suicides, like citing all the gun deaths, including suicides, as a reason to ban assault weapons. It's almost like they're building this like pyre of like of middle-aged men who've killed themselves, and then using that to justify banning a weapon that actually harms almost no one comparatively. Like a complete disconnect between the statistics they're citing and what they want to do. And so that's what a mature conversation about guns looks like. We don't have that in this country because it's a cultural war conversation.
Thank you for listening to Reimagining Liberty. If you like the show and want to support it, head to reimaginingliberty.com to learn more. You'll get early access to all my essays, as well as be able to join the Reimagining Liberty Discord community and book club. That's reimaginingliberty.com, or look for the link in the show notes. Talk to you soon.